this. I'm on StarWars.net, and I'm looking at the cover of Starlog in 1987, and it says A Trip Down Memory Lane. The article that they have here on StarWarsNews.com is StarWarsNewsNet.com. It says this: 1987, a time of great uncertainty. The Cold War had not yet ended. A hole in the ozone layer was being fed by the world's addiction to the overuse of hairspray. The original trilogy was at an end. To the general public, Star Wars was over. Although toys were still everywhere, the steady stream of content was slowly drying up as we barreled towards the 1990s. To the average Star Wars fan, this may have been seen as an end, but the diehards knew that this wasn't the end, but just a brief hiatus. By the way, talk about being spoiled. Here I am complaining that we haven't had any Star Wars news in 2 weeks. Think about the drought of the 90s before we got the prequel trilogy movies and the amount of Star Wars sort of drought that they went through, and that we will never, ever be in a period of a drought like that again. So perhaps my whole complaining that we haven't had any news in a few weeks is really lame. It just tells you how much I'm clamoring for Star Wars news. But really, let's be honest, there's been plenty out there, comparatively speaking. But all things are relative, right? We got spoiled during the Force Awakens. That's not the thing that I wanted to focus on at all. This is a personal thing for me, but just an observation. I'm looking at the cover of the Starlog magazine from 1987, and it's a poster for Star Wars, and it's not one of the, well, it's one of the major poster graphics, but not one of the major ones, and it was an early piece of art. So it's got Darth Vader on it, holding a red, orangish lightsaber. The lightsaber hilt obviously was new. It looks more like a candle holder than it does a lightsaber hilt. Dead center is Luke Skywalker with the blaster pointing outwards. To the right, to the left of looking at it, to the right if you're standing in frame. To the left of Luke Skywalker, if you're looking at it, is Han Solo running with the blaster firing a shot. To the right of Luke Skywalker is Princess Leia. Down below, you have Chewie and C-3PO and R2. Some X-Wings off to the right. X-Wings and TIE Fighters to the left. Death Star in the background. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Tarkin are both featured prominently, as is a concept art Y-Wing. Okay, this is a classic from the 70s, 77 or 78 piece of Star Wars artwork. The point I want to make on this is that, for me, the only pieces of 70s nostalgia or artwork that I still think are super cool is Star Wars. Maybe Alien, to a certain extent. But even Alien, to me, comes off as very dated. Star Wars doesn't. I just wanted to take a moment and just mention that power that Star Wars has to be both nostalgic and somehow modern and fresh at the same time. I can't think of any other movie, as old as A New Hope is, that still, to me, is just amazing and cool to watch. Nothing stands up to it in my... There's no other movie from that time period that I can think of that has that kind of nostalgic weight, but yet is still modern and fresh and cool to look at and doesn't look dated. I mean, it really does play into what a fantastic job they all did in creating this universe. It really does go and speak to the genius of George Lucas in creating this lived-in world, and in doing so, he created something that is just absolutely timeless. It's amazing. And it's me personally. I'm sure there are other people that have things from that time period that they still think are awesome and cool, but I like newer things, right? I'm a huge Depeche Mode fan, but their first couple of records just don't do it for me anymore. I can't listen to them. They're way too dated. I'm a NASCAR fan, but I don't hold in high regard the nostalgia of old NASCAR race cars or races. I don't think I'd go back and watch an old race. I like everything fresh and new. Star Wars is really the only thing that I have that really from that time period that's that old that I still just loves so dearly and still carries the same kind of merit, emotional weight, and coolness about it. The X-Wings, the original X-Wings and TIE Fighters are still cool. And again, that's another reason why I'm so excited to see Rogue One. Because of what they're going to bring to the table. And how Rogue One is going to enhance the original trilogy just like The Force Awakens did. Like, when I go back and watch the original trilogy now, I'm paying way more attention to all the detail. Because that's what's so great about Star Wars. Everything in Star Wars is cool. Because everything in Star Wars had to be made from scratch to fit Star Wars. And that in and of itself is awesome. From the spaceships to the vehicles to the aliens to the lights being used on a display board to the command center on a Star Destroyer to the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon to the interior of a TIE Fighter. I mean, all of it. It all had to be handcrafted and made specifically to fit into the Star Wars universe. And again, it's just part of that genius of what George Lucas was able to accomplish. James Cameron, and I mentioned this in a previous podcast, James Cameron came out and kind of harped on The Force Awakens and gave praise at the same time to George Lucas, saying that, The Force Awakens was just a rehash of what we've seen before, and, George Lucas was doing something brave with the prequel trilogy because he always brought something new to the table and tried to push the limits and boundaries, and all that's true. It doesn't make The Force Awakens any less great just because they just switched up the TIE Fighters and X-Wings a little bit, and we didn't really get a diversity of vehicles. It doesn't make it any less great, but James Cameron has a point. George Lucas did push the boundaries in the prequels. He pushed the limits of technology. He tried to do something different. He created new vehicles. He did try to retroactively design vehicles so that you could see how they kind of morphed into the vehicles we saw in the original trilogy. I will say that there is something in that George Lucas missed the mark in trying to push the boundaries and doing something new, but in the prequels, he did make it look like that they happened after the original trilogy. In terms of the technology and the view screens in some vehicles. I know there's logic there in that what we saw was sort of the height of decadence of the Star Wars galaxy before the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire that sort of cast a dark shadow over everything, in which case you could rationalize how everything doesn't look quite as shiny and new as it did in the prequel trilogy. But look, let's be honest. George Lucas made everything look a lot more shiny and new in the prequel trilogy than he did the original trilogy, but it still is all cool. Probably a better example of where they failed on this is, again, going back to the Alien example. The original Alien had a lot of analog going on, but you look at Prometheus, and the Prometheus ship was obviously way more advanced than the Nostromo was in Alien. And again, you rationalize that away, even though that movie took place way, way, way before Alien did. I guess you rationalize it away with the Prometheus was funded by a large corporation that had a heck of a lot more money for the technology, and the Nostromo was simply a big, truck in space that could have been, 30 years old, but it was functionally appropriate for the time. I mean, again, that's how you rationalize it in your head, even though that's not the reality of what took place with it. So all that being said, Star Wars does a better job of getting away with that, but I'm just that one image on this Starlog magazine prompted that little rant. Just looking at that and how dated it's obvious from the 70s. You can just tell by the tint and the way that the characters were drawn and how some of the things weren't not totally accurate, but it still has this fresh and instantly cool nostalgia factor to it, right? I just love it so much. All right, let's switch gears.
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?
I'll be keeping the podcast a little bit short today just because of the lack of news over the past couple of weeks, and I have some other things I have to get to. But a few other items I want to talk about. One being Lost Stars. If you haven't read Lost Stars yet, just like everybody else that's raved about it, you need to go read Lost Stars. It really, really is a fantastic novel. Claudia Gray she is a great writer. And this is a really interesting, fun read. There are some parts that drag a little bit, but for the most part, I found it just infinitely enjoyable. I was surprised. Did you hear my voice crack there a little bit? Yeah. I was surprised in Lost Stars that nobody really harped on, and I guess it isn't really necessary, but nobody really harped on, and this isn't a spoiler, but the male protagonist in the movie ends up being a deserter of the Empire. And I just thought that was rather interesting because they made such a big deal. At least Lawrence Kasdan did. And all these things are kind of separate. I mean, they're in the Star Wars universe, but it's not like Lawrence Kasdan and JJ Abrams are consulting with Claudia Gray for the most part. She's given her boundaries of which she can write in, and then other individuals make sure that it fits into the canon of the story and fits in with The Force Awakens. But it's just interesting that this movie, Lost Stars, is about, long before The Force Awakens, some 30 years before The Force Awakens when it starts, is about... the male protagonist, at least, is about him leaving the Empire to go join the Rebellion, which is essentially what Finn did in leaving, the First Order to go join the Resistance. I'm surprised nobody had mentioned that similarity. I mean, it kind of stops there based off the story, but as I was reading it, it actually made me, and it's part of the reason why I ended up watching Force Awakens this weekend, as I was reading it, it made me want to go watch The Force Awakens because it reminded me of the Finn story in The Force Awakens of him deserting the First Order. And the more I thought about it reading the book, the more I personally rationalized it by saying, well... look, there were a lot of deserters of the Empire, I'm sure. And the book even alludes to other people that left the Empire. So it really stands to reason that, Finn isn't necessarily unique in ditching the First Order any more than Thane was unique in Lost Stars in ditching the Empire. But all that is to say that, it's a really, really good read. A really fun read for being kind of a young adult novel. I was... kind of excited for my 9-year-old to read it, but there was just a couple of moments in there where I went, those themes are a little more than I want him to read. And that's my only complaint. I'm not a prude by any stretch of the imagination, but the fact that they push the limits as it relates to sex and one particular altercation, which wasn't bad or graphic, but it was just enough to where I wouldn't want my 9-year-old reading it. And I was a little bit disappointed in that. I'm sure there are probably some parents that may allow them to do that. But for me personally, it was just a little bit too early to have him going and, reading something at that level. But all that being said, if you're looking for something Star Wars to placate you while you're waiting for Rogue One and you haven't checked any of the novels out yet, Lost Stars is an absolute must. It covers the entire original trilogy. And just like The Force Awakens sort of enhances the original trilogy and Rogue One will, Lost Stars does that too, because it ends up taking place during some of the key moments in the original trilogy, and it gives you an angle on those moments from the movies and actually sort of placement in scenes that I'm looking forward to going back and watching the original trilogy, having now read Lost Stars, just because I'll have Lost Stars to reference at certain parts of the film because of where these particular characters are placed in the original trilogy. So that in and of itself is really kind of cool. And I dig the fact that they're doing this very specific reference to the original trilogy, so they all kind of lay on top of each other. I think that's just really neat. And again, it just enhances those original trilogy movies, and makes them, gives you another reason to watch them, essentially. So 2 more things I want to get to on the podcast today. One being that JJ Abrams mentioned that he'd like to see a Knights of Ren spinoff movie. He was asked what movies he'd like to see, and he said, Kathleen Kennedy's doing a great job, blah, 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 blah. And then he mentioned that he'd like to see a Knights of Ren story, which kind of makes you think that if he's read the script for Episode 8, which he says he has, then we may not be getting much of a background on the Knights of Ren, which is okay. I mean, when we saw the original trilogy, we didn't really have a background on the Jedi Knights until the prequels came out, so we don't need to be told everything. But it is an interesting choice that J.J. Abrams said. Obviously, that story's been written somewhere, that he would like to see that movie. I always thought my idea for a Star Wars movie, was something a little bit smaller and more intimate. I always thought that my fantasy Star Wars spinoff movie would be a story about the guy who created the X-Wing fighter. Kind of in the same